Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living a life in peace. You may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us, and the world will be as one.
Just when you work your whole life, you don't want to wind up with zero at the end of the day.
Many of us who are in the pre-retirement times look ahead and realize how invested we are in the very market that we don't trust.
My solution is, if you can't build within this community and people who think alike, to build their own community and show example to the rest of the world that, yeah, well, we can work a community in our ways.
Walk on the street, you go around my corner, you have people homeless, sleeping in the street. There's no need for that. Sending all this money to other countries, rebuilding other countries, how about us? How about all people that live in the streets, children living in shelters? It's just not fair.
I am the co-owner of Crosby Mint Farm in St. John's, Michigan. We raise 140 acres of mint. We are currently being foreclosed on by Greenstone Farm Credit Services. Back in 2006, we got late in one payment for our farm, and they decided in that agreement they can close on all of our loans. We had 4 loans, and what happened, they decided to close on all 4 of them.
It's just a pitiful situation. I don't hardly know what to say, but they are in the process of putting all the little people out of business. Everything's got to go co-op or big where they can control everything.
I'm very interested in stories about local economies where they've actually set up their own local currency. And I would love to see that happen in the small town that I live in.
So what is the first step then? We need to be self-sufficient in order to compete with the current economy. Yet we need large amounts of money to become self-sufficient. Is there a way to manipulate the current system in order to start securing resources?
People realize that the government's creating this money out of thin air, and you use the term loosely, printing, because they actually create credit, which is essentially the same as printing money. Most people realize, well, how can they do that? And most people know that counterfeiting is wrong and immoral and illegal. But here we have a system of money where we have permitted the politician, in collusion with the central bankers, to create unlimited amounts of money. Some weeks they create $30 billion in 1 week to accommodate this system.
A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. We will use the Federal Reserve as our example, but this system is exactly the same for most countries with a central bank, including Canada and the United Kingdom. When the United States government decides it needs more money, it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests an amount, let's say $10 billion. The Fed responds always with a yes and turns around and offers to purchase $10 billion in government bonds. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to a sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed drop some impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time they call them Federal Reserve notes, also designated a value of $10 billion. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account, and upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. Enter inflation. Because the government has not increased its wealth, but only the money supply, each individual dollar is worth a little bit less. Imagine now that the U.S. government requests upwards of $30 billion a week. And this is only the first step in money creation under the fractional reserve banking system. Government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt, and when the Fed purchases these bonds with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money, or value, can be created out of debt or liability is essentially what has brought our current economy to its knees. No one actually owns anything because every dollar in creation is owed back to the Federal Reserve with interest. Now, back to fractional reserve banking. The exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here is where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating under current regulations the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually false. What is actually happening is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, Of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits, money, to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now let's assume that somebody walks into the bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and the remaining 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion, to 6.5 billion, to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion in deposits. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air. So how does the fractional reserve system benefit anyone other than the banks? To be honest, it doesn't. Banks are the only institutions that are allowed to create money and then demand they earn profit on this created money by lending it out at interest. So how can we, the 99%, use this system to our advantage? The first step to creating an alternate economy is gaining access to this money-creating power. The first step to creating an alternate economy is forming a bank. If a group of like-minded individuals decided to join together and form a bank, they could then deposit all of their savings into that bank. Once their savings are locked safely away in their vault, they could isolate 10% of it to hold as their reserves and then turn around and lend the other 90% back to themselves by forming corporations. These corporations would then use these loans to start buying up resources. First food, then steel, lumber, and fresh water production. Before long, the community would have access to many essential resources, yet their savings will remain untouched in their bank accounts. They can keep buying resources in this way until the community is producing an excess. At this point, the community can truly start to consider forming an alternate economy, with its own set of rules and its own currency. We will no longer care what the outside world thinks, because we will be self-sufficient. Whatever resources we still need, we can trade for our excess production. If they insist on buying them with their dollars, we will sell them our resources and buy back the ones we need with the dollars we receive from them. We will keep doing this, only selling the excess and never depleting our production until we no longer need anything from the outside world. At this point, they can keep their interest and their inflation and their banks that need to be profitable. Our community will understand that a bank is an institution with no feelings or families to support. Our community will use their bank as a tool, a balancing agent, in order to create wealth for all of its members, in harmony with the environment. The technology already exists to do this, but they simply are not profitable. Perhaps it is time to reevaluate what is of value to us. Perhaps it is time for the alternate economy to form a bank.
This entire system is broken and needs to be replaced. And everything from the monetary system to the capitalist system, all the governmental institutions, our government itself, it all needs to be changed. The way our community is heading needs to be changed. That's what change means to me.
My dream of where the economy is going is I'm hoping that we're heading for a whole new entire system, the way that we organize our economy.
I think we need to back up a little. I mean, we need growth, we need jobs to employ people. That goes without saying. But I think maybe we need to back off a little and not make money the most important thing in the world. I used to live in Africa, and Africans knew they were poor, and by being poor they had each other.
Fallen the major lift, a baffled king composing hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah.
Are you ready for change?
Hallelujah.